Okay, so welcome to the second part of the lecture. In this section, we're going to talk about the six core processes that are involved in acceptance and commitment therapy. So, just a reminder, these are the six core processes: acceptance, attention to the present moment, values, committed action, the self as context, and diffusion. And remember, the ones on the left are considered to be mindful and acceptance practices or processes, and then the ones on the right can be considered behavioral activation processes or processes which align your behaviors with values that you hold. So, we said that the six core processes of the ACT Hexaflex result in what we call psychological flexibility. The opposite of those processes result in psychological inflexibility or psychological rigidity. So, one of our core processes is diffusion, and the opposite of diffusion is cognitive fusion. So, this is when our thoughts become ingrained in us, we become entangled in our thoughts. We can't stand back and view our thoughts for what they are. Our thoughts almost become rules to us, they become the truth, and we become very dictated to by our thoughts. So we're not able to evaluate thoughts as they are. So when I was giving this lecture, just before we closed, I said that we have hundreds of thousands of thoughts every day. How many times have you been walking along a bridge and thought, what would happen if I threw my phone in the river? Or what would happen if I pushed that person? Or what would happen if I did something stupid? You don't act on those thoughts. You could have a thought, what would happen if I knocked over this bottle of water that's in front of me? We've lots of thoughts that stream through our head minute by minute, day by day. Do we act on all those thoughts? No, absolutely not. But there are some thoughts that we latch onto, that we put a lot of meaning into, put a lot of effort into, and we fuse with those thoughts. So we're not able to stand back and see them for what they are. We think they are the absolute truth, something that we absolutely have to follow and something that we absolutely have to do. So, an example of cognitive fusion, for example, if someone is with depression is fused with the thought, I don't have enough confidence. So, this thought is something that becomes really ingrained in them. They are fused with it. It becomes their absolute truth or it becomes something that they just fundamentally believe. It's likely that they're going to do less because this thought is fused with them. So I don't have enough confidence. So I don't have enough confidence to go to the party. I don't have enough confidence to go and talk to those people. I don't have enough confidence to go into college. Doing less then sets up a cycle in which there's a reduced contact with actual events and a further natural loss of confidence. So because they are not engaging in events and not going and doing things, then naturally they're going to have a reduction in confidence anyway. So fusion with this thought is strengthened and then a pattern's established that over time can develop into a more serious disorder. So when we become fused with a thought, it becomes right up, really close up in our face, and we can't see through it. We can't see past it. We think it is absolute truth. So when someone becomes fused with their thoughts or fused with specific thoughts, ACT aims to create some space, aims to defuse the situation. So, in a process called cognitive diffusion, we aim to create some space between the individual and their thoughts. So, again, remember that ACT is very much based on the function. So, we're looking at the function of these thoughts and we're trying to dilute the impact of these harmful functions of the thoughts. So, ACT and specifically cognitive diffusion involves trying to shift the focus away from the content of the thoughts to the process of thinking itself, therefore weakening the verbally ascribed functions. So, what that means is, as I said, we have hundreds of thousands of thoughts every day. You know that, oh, that's just a silly thought, the thought I had to throw my phone over this bridge or to push that person or to knock over my water bottle or to, do whatever silly thing comes to mind. That's a thought and you know that's a thought. And you think of it just as a thought. You go, that's a silly thought that I had. But some thoughts we latch onto. So, for example, the thought, I don't have enough confidence. I'm not a good person. I can't do that. For some reason, we latch onto those specific thoughts and we fuse with them. So, cognitive diffusion aims to say, okay, let's not focus on what the actual thought is saying, but let's focus on the fact that it is just a thought that you're having. So, this thought, like any other thought that you're having, is just passing by, it's fleeting, it's momentary. So diffusion aims to create distance or create space, as if the individual is standing back from their mind, observing it, being able to say, yep, there's a thought that I'm having. Oh, look, there's another thought. That's something that's happening, etc., etc. So you can have a thought, have the thought right now of a giant pink elephant walking into the room. That's a thought that you're having. You know that's a thought that you're having. You know it's not real. You know it's not true. That exact same process happens when we have negative thoughts about ourselves. But for some reason, we believe those thoughts are true. So ACT attempts to change the way we interact with or relate to our thoughts by creating a context in which their unhelpful functions are diminished. So again, remember, we're looking at the context of thoughts, we're looking at the context of behaviors, and we're looking at the functions of these behaviors. So we aim to create diffusion by creating a context where their functions, their negative functions, are reduced. So there's a number of different techniques that have been used to try to create some cognitive diffusion and create space between people and their thoughts. Oftentimes, the first thing I tell people to do is just simply use a few words. Say, I'm having the thought that, and then have your negative thought afterwards. So as opposed to saying, I can't do this, or I'm going to fail, or I'm a bad person, or I don't have enough confidence. If you're just put in front of it, I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough. I'm having the thought that I'm not a good person. I'm having the thought that I'm going to fail. Then you're saying this doesn't have to be true. This isn't actually a thing that's definitely going to happen. It's just a thought that I'm having. The same way I'm having the thought that wouldn't it be funny if I trip my friend up? Or wouldn't it be funny if something else happened? So you're having a thought and it is just a thought. So a few techniques have been created. So they do things like they get you to repeat the word or repeat the thought out loud until only a sound remains. Because again, remember, we have a lot of functions to our words. When I say the word milk, you can imagine the color white, you can imagine what it tastes like. If you don't like it, if you do like it, you have a lot of things that are associated with the word milk when I say the word milk. But if I was to say milk, 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 milk over and over again, it becomes just a series of sounds and it doesn't have any meaning to it. So the function of the word milk disappears. So they do that with your negative thoughts that you're having. So they'll pick out a keyword. It might be failure, it might be loner, it might be any kind of negative word that's within your thought, and they'll get you to say it out loud over and over again until it effectively loses all meaning and loses all function. You can see there at the bottom the process of thinking. I'm having the thought that. That's one that I think is really useful and really helpful. And they also do things like they'll get you to create a kind of an image for your thought. So like it's a person, and then you become familiar with the thought and you say, oh, look, there's the thought coming up again. Or they'll say, thank you, brain, for giving me that thought. Or so just creating an awareness that it is simply just a thought, and it's not something that we have to buy into. So, experiential avoidance is something that massively contributes to psychological distress, and it's something that a lot of people do. And it's one of the things that ACT says is the core reason for psychological distresses occurring. So, experiential avoidance is the unwillingness to experience certain private events, certain emotions, certain thoughts, and engaging in behaviors which reduce the frequency or reduce how painful these thoughts and feelings are. So, effectively, we're unwilling. We don't want to feel sad. We don't want to feel anxious. We don't want to feel upset. And we'll do whatever it takes not to feel those emotions and those and have those thoughts. So, we'll avoid thinking about certain topics because it makes us too anxious. We'll avoid going to certain places because it makes us too upset. We'll avoid seeing or talking to certain people because they might get angry at us. We don't want to engage in these negative emotions, and so we take steps to try to avoid them. This can become really problematic because then all of a sudden we start avoiding any kind of stimulus that's associated with these negative feelings. And we know that negative feelings are normal, they're part of the human experience, so we have to experience them. But again, remember, from a behavioral point of view, these negative feelings, thoughts, etc., they are stimuli. They are aversive stimuli, which means they are negative stimuli. What happens from a behavioral point of view when we come in contact with an aversive stimulus? We either try to escape it or we try to avoid it. So, again, from a behavioral point of view, this makes sense. We're engaging in avoidant behaviors to stop ourselves from coming in contact with anything that's negative or anything that might upset us. So this can also have the opposite effect from which we desire. So, for example, you might think to yourself, I'm just not going to think about that. It's really painful, it's really upsetting, or it's something I don't want to think about. So you do anything you can to stop yourself from thinking about it. You might get yourself really busy, make yourself really, really busy, do lots of things so that you don't have time to think about it. You might avoid talking to certain people. You might avoid looking at certain people's social media pages. You might, do anything you can to stop yourself from feeling or thinking these negative thoughts. But what's going to happen then when eventually you've run out of things to do and you can't be busy anymore? Those thoughts are going to come back. What happens when you're scrolling and you accidentally see a picture of your ex or you accidentally see a picture of that friend group that you're no longer friends with? Suddenly those feelings come up. You can't avoid them. They become much bigger. What do we know again from a behavioral point of view happens when we come in contact with aversive stimuli? We habituate to them. If you're avoiding something, you don't get the opportunity to habituate to it. And then when eventually you do come in contact with it, it's so much worse. It's really, really painful. So often this experiential avoidance, trying to avoid coming in contact or trying to avoid feeling negative feelings or having negative thoughts, can often create a worse situation for us. So again, this idea of trying to avoid things is based on the idea that we should be feeling good. We shouldn't be feeling bad. We shouldn't feel negative things. So do anything we can to stay happy. Do anything we can to stay positive and stay uplifted. So here's another example of how experiential avoidance can lead to mental health problems. So social anxiety is a very clear example of experiential avoidance. So thinking of a forthcoming social event may create concerns about possible rejection or an inability to make conversation. Choosing to avoid the event produces immediate relief, but in the long term can lead to more problems. In terms of psychosis, then, hallucinations from a behavioral point of view are an extreme form of a verbal event. A person experiencing them may try strategies such as arguing them away, denying their occurrence, or avoiding situations where they might occur. Over time, this could cause hallucinations to dominate further and behavior to become more extreme. So the opposite to experiential avoidance is acceptance. So as opposed to trying to avoid these negative emotions, avoid these negative feelings, and do anything we can to stay away from them, ACT asks you to accept these emotions for what they are, accept these thoughts for what they are. So acceptance is taught as an alternative to experiential avoidance. So acceptance involves the active and aware embrace of these private events that have come up and that are based on our history and are based on things that we've experienced in the past. So again, ACT isn't trying to decrease the frequency of these thoughts. We're not trying to decrease the frequency of the emotions. We're not trying to change the emotions. We can't go back and change the past. We can't change what created these thoughts or these emotions. And it's very hard to change the actual thought or change the actual emotion itself. So we're not trying to do that. This can also create more harm and create more damage. But what ACT is asking you to do is just to accept them, let them be there. It's okay that they're there, they're normal, they're part of the human condition. So, for example, anxiety patients are taught to feel anxiety as a feeling fully and without defense. Pain patients are given methods that encourage them to let go of the struggle with pain, and so on and so forth. So, oftentimes we struggle, we engage in it in almost a fight with ourselves to try to not feel negative or not feel bad. And that fight is really tough to do. So, for example, with anxiety patients, we teach them, yeah, this is anxiety. There's your heart rate is increasing, your stomach is going funny, your palms are sweating, you have an awful dry feeling in your mouth, your mind might be going 90. Experience that. That's fine. That's okay. If we try to suppress that, if we try to push it down, that can potentially result in panic attacks. That can potentially result in the anxiety manifesting itself to such a large extent that it becomes overwhelming. But what's wrong with feeling anxiety? Anxiety is a normal human emotion. What's wrong with feeling sad? Sadness is a normal human emotion. So acceptance and diffusion are two massive parts of ACT, but they're not ACT completely and wholly, and there's more to ACT than just these two processes, but they are very influential and they are very important processes within ACT. So acceptance is created as a method to increase value-based action. So again, remember, we've said that ACT looks at mindfulness and acceptance techniques, and it looks at the behavioral bit. So the behavioral bit is you want to engage in behaviors, do things that you want to do that are in line with your values. But what if your emotions and your thoughts are stopping you from doing the things that you want to do? So, for example, that person who has social anxiety, they might really want to have friends. They might really want to go to that party. But what's stopping them? Their thoughts, their emotions. Their thoughts and their emotions are controlling their behaviors. So, what ACT says is let's create some acceptance of our thoughts and of our emotions in order to increase your value based behavior, your value based action, which for the person with social anxiety might be they might value going to a party. The way they can go to a party is not if they struggle and fight against their thoughts, because that's going to create an even worse situation, but if they accept their thoughts, accept their feelings, and say, yep, those are there, I'm going to accept them, but they're not going to control my behaviors. And then engage in behaviors which are aligned with your values. So, from an ACT perspective, acceptance is something that we have to willingly engage in and it's something that we choose to do. It might not be easy, but it is a behavior that we actively choose to engage in. So, as ACT therapists, we're going to be asking clients to make room for this difficult, hard emotion to experience. And we're not saying that this is the easy way out, we're not saying this is going to be quick and easy, but it is important to be able to accept the emotions because otherwise we're going to spend a lot of time trying to fight against them, trying to change them, trying to fix what happened in the past, trying to restructure them. And we're having these negative emotions for a reason. So let's experience them. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be anxious. So experience them and then let's get through them. So again, we're always looking at the function of things within ACT. So when we're looking at the function of acceptance, we're going to accept these negative emotions or these negative thoughts or whatever they are. We're going to accept them. And the function of that acceptance is going to be that it's going to help us to act in a way that aligns with our values. And the values bit is very important to the definition of acceptance. And acceptance and values go hand in hand. So as I've said, the function of acceptance helps us with active steps towards what we value. If we spend all our time and energy engaging in the battle, trying to change our thoughts, trying to change our emotions, trying to avoid our thoughts, trying to avoid our emotions, then that's going to inhibit our ability to act and behave in a way that we want to or that's in line with our values. If we can accept our emotions and just let them be there and experience them, then they don't have to control us, they don't have to dictate our behaviors, and it's going to be it's going to take slightly less energy than if we're constantly struggling and fighting with them. So the function of acceptance is to help with active steps towards our values, whereas experiential avoidance has the opposite function. So it also has a functional definition that's linked to values, whereby experiential avoidance stops us engaging in behaviors. The function of experiential avoidance stops us engaging in behaviors that are aligned to our values and are aligned to things that we want to do. Now, it is important to note as well that we all go through varying levels and varying degrees of experiential avoidance. But we only target experiential avoidance when it becomes harmful and when it impacts on our behaviors. So, for example, someone coming home on a Friday night and having a few glasses of wine or having a few drinks so that they don't have to think about the tough week that they had. They're avoiding thinking about the negative things that happened during the week. They're avoiding thinking about the stress, and the behavior they're engaging in is using alcohol as a coping mechanism to relieve the stress or anxiety of the week. That's fine. That's grand. That's not a problem. But where it does become a problem is if that person is using alcohol to avoid feelings and thoughts to the extent that it impacts on their behaviors, and so that it stops them from dropping the kids to school, it stops them from getting out of bed in the morning, it stops them from engaging in behaviors which are important to them. So if experiential avoidance, if the function of experiential avoidance is going to be that it impacts negatively on your behaviors, which should be bringing you to your goals and to your values, that's when we intervene. If having a few glasses of wine on a Friday night is experiential avoidance for a stressful week, that's fine as long as it's not negatively impacting on your valued behaviors. So this is a nice quote from Bennett and Oliver. It says that the process of acceptance is relatively paradoxical. Oftentimes, clients will arrive in a session looking for ways to avoid experiences, and they often have an extensive and varied history of doing so. So, what that means is oftentimes clients will come in and they'll be looking for a way to stop feeling what they're feeling, to stop their thoughts, to avoid thinking about their thoughts, to avoid coming in contact with their feelings. And often they'll have a history of their own way of how they've done it. So, they've avoided thinking about certain topics, they've avoided talking to certain people, etc., etc. But the issue here is to move their focus to highlight that their control strategies are actually the source of the problem. So their way of trying to control their thoughts and control their emotions actually creates more problems than it helps. As Kirk Strozel, one of the originators of ACT, likes to say, the problem is not the problem, the solution is the problem. So the problem isn't the actual emotion or thought itself. The problem is the solution that the person has been trying to create to solve this problem. So they've been trying to engage in suppression of emotion, avoidance of thoughts, all these kind of things to try to fix the problem. So in this case, it's actually the solution that they've been engaging in, which is the problem. The work of the therapist is to help the client see how excessive control engenders a futile struggle. So excessively trying to control our thoughts or emotions is going to create a conflict. The paradox is that when we let go of unnecessary struggle and stop fighting with that which is there anyway, respite occurs. So those thoughts and emotions are going to be there anyway, and when we stop fighting with them and struggling with them, it actually becomes a sense of relief. Choosing acceptance reduces the chances of compounding perceived problems, leaving more energy to devote to things that actually matter in life. So, the third process within the ACT Hexaflex is coming in contact with the present moment. So, what does this mean? Well, life in the world is a busy place, and we spend a lot of time in our heads, and we spend a lot of time thinking about what we have to do next, and what are we going to do later, and what happened a few minutes ago, etc., etc. So, we spend a lot of time thinking, planning, problem solving, analyzing, etc., etc. And this is great, and this is wonderful, and this is part of the human experience and part of the things that we can do that differentiate us from animals. But when do we get a chance to just be, to experience, to exist? So, contact with the present moment talks about our thinking mode and our being mode. So, our thinking mode of mind is contrasted with our being mode of mind. And our being mode of mind is one which we experience less frequently, and it's one that isn't as common for us to engage with. So we spend so much time thinking, what am I going to say in this text message? Did that person reply to me? Do I have a notification on Snapchat? Should I be reading more for my classes? What am I going to do to study for the assignment? We don't have a lot of time, or we don't engage in experiencing and being in the moment. So the being mode is one that we engage in less. So our being mode is more connected to our five senses, and it gives us a heightened sense of the present moment and of our present awareness. So it's very much about, what are you currently hearing? What are you currently seeing? How do you feel? What are you touching? So this kind of contact with the present moment component of ACT is very much related to kind of mindfulness and presence and awareness. So I always think it's really interesting to think about, what are we doing while we're thinking? When we're thinking, what kind of thoughts do we have? Typically, when we're thinking, we're either thinking about the past or we're thinking about the future. What am I going to have for dinner? How long is it going to take me to get through this lecture? What am I going to do when I'm finished this lecture? What am I going to say to this person? What am I going to do tomorrow? What was I doing yesterday that I didn't get finished that I should be doing today? Etc., etc. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the past or thinking about the future. We're always trying to plan or predict what hasn't happened yet. So when we're thinking about the future, we're often planning, predicting, trying to anticipate what's coming next. Or we spend too much time ruminating about what's happened in the past. So these are two features that very often occur in individuals who have anxiety type thoughts or depressive type thoughts. So individuals who have anxious thoughts, they're often thinking about the future. What will happen? How am I going to predict what happens? Trying to plan, trying to predict the future. And this is when these thought patterns can become negative. And then similarly with people who have depressive thoughts, they're often thinking about things that happened in the past and ruminating or spending a lot of time focused on what happened in the past. So as we spend this time going from thinking about the future to thinking about the past, as we time travel in and out of the present, our ability to be able to connect with the present moment and respond to actual contingencies, actual opportunities in front of us declines. So we avoid, or we don't respond to potential situations or potential contingencies that we have going on right here, right now, at this moment, because we're busy thinking about the future or thinking about the past. So this can lead to kind of inflexible responding based on the ways we've conceptualized our past or our future. So we've conceptualized or thought about our past so much or thought about our future so much that we have relatively strict visions or strict views of what our future and of what our past are. So for example, we might say, I can't open up to my partner because I've been hurt too many times before in the past. So when that opportunity arises in that moment, at that time with that person, you don't do it because you spend so much time thinking about, well, last time I did this, I got hurt, or last time this happened, it was a negative thing. You've got the potential to access positive social reinforcement from this new partner, from this new person, open up to them, be vulnerable with them, and create a positive relationship. That's a contingency that's right here, right now, in the present moment. But you're avoiding it, you're not engaging with it because you're spending so much time thinking about, last time I did this, it really hurt. Last time I did this, it wasn't good for me. Or, for example, I'm not going to take a risk because it will lead to a catastrophe. So you're not willing to engage in the risk of going up and talking to someone in a bar, or, doing something that might be a little bit outside your comfort zone because it's potentially going to lead to a catastrophe. You're forward thinking. You're thinking, if I do this, something bad's going to come out of it. Potentially that something great could come out of it. So we spend so much time either thinking about what might happen or trying to predict what will happen in the future, or thinking about what happened in the past, that it controls what we're doing at the moment, at the current time. We lose opportunities to engage with contingencies that are present for us right here, right now, because we're so forward thinking or backward thinking. While both these thoughts might be true, and yeah, maybe you did get hurt before in the past, and maybe it will, taking this risk will end up in you making a fool of yourself or embarrassing yourself. If we fuse ourselves to these thoughts, if they become controlling of our behaviors, then they're going to limit our behaviors, and we're going to end up in a pattern of very limited and very repetitive behaviors because we're thinking about what might happen in the future or what has happened in the past. So contact with the present moment tries to create an environment and a context for us to appreciate what's happening right here, right now, bring us back to our current state and stop us from ruminating too much in the past or trying to predict what's going to happen in the future, being more aware and being more present of the here and now. So, ACT promotes a non judgmental contact with our psychological and environmental events as they occur. So, being aware of the thoughts that you're currently having, being aware of the emotions you're currently experiencing, being aware of the physiological feelings you're feeling, and observing them but not casting judgment on them. The goal is for clients to experience the world more directly so that their behavior is more flexible and not based on future thoughts or past thoughts, and so that our behaviors are more aligned with values that we hold currently at this time in this moment. So we use language as a tool to try to note and describe our events, not to simply predict them and judge them. So we're not trying to pass any judgment on things that are happening. We're simply describing them as they're happening right here, right now. So this aims to try to develop a sense of self, and we call this sense of self the self as process. We won't delve too much into that; it's a little bit more advanced. But this kind of sense of self is actively encouraged, whereby we have a place where we're diffused from our thoughts and we're non-judgmental on them, and we're describing our thoughts and feelings and our other private events. So the fourth ACT process, which helps with psychological flexibility, is the self as context. Now, the self as context is a little bit trickier to understand, and it's a little bit more based in RFT research. But the self as context is also referred to as observing the self. Now, we spoke about the ability to frame stimuli such as I versus you, now versus then, here versus there, etc. And so, in order to fully understand I, you have to have it in a frame with you or with other people. And so, how do you relate I to you? You could relate them as different. So, I am different to you. You can relate them as comparing, I compared to you. And to understand I or yourself properly and fully, you have to be able to understand that it's different to other people. So, this creates then a sense of self as our own perspective. My own perspective might be different to your own perspective. What I experience might not be the same as what you experience. So, we ourselves are the context for our private events and our behaviors. There's growing evidence of the importance of language in terms of our ability to be empathetic, in terms of theory of mind. So, again, theory of mind is effectively being able to compare or relate yourself to other people and understand that other people think differently to yourself. But also, it gives us a sense of self, your ability to understand that you as a person are different to other people. So, almost you could say that your sense of self and your theory of mind are opposites. So you've got a sense of your own self, who you are, what you're thinking, and then your theory of mind says that other people think differently. So I versus you are in a relational frame, and they can be in a relational frame of opposition, of comparison. So we're relating I as a stimulus to you as a stimulus. So much of our internal content or much of our private events, they ebb and they flow constantly. So we're constantly changing, our thoughts are changing, our emotions are changing, etc. But as we engage with the world and with other people, we're required to be able to give an account of ourselves. So it's required that we're able to say, what are we thinking? What are our emotions? What are our thoughts? Who are we effectively? So society demands that we are able to give an account of who we are and describe who we are and what we like, what we don't like, what our personalities are, etc., etc. So we learn to provide reasons for our behaviors based on this account of ourselves that we have. So we create a context of ourselves. I am a good person. I am bad at maths. I am good at sports. I am bad at something else. So we create this profile or this account of ourselves, and it's based on comparisons with other people. So I am good at sports is only I am good at sports if other people aren't as good, or if other people are worse, or if other people have told me I'm good at sports. So this self as context is based on our comparison with other people and our ability to be able to create a sense of self. And based on this sense of self, or based on this account of ourselves, we provide reasons for our behaviors, and we learn to identify our own personal motivations, our own desires, our own beliefs, and wishes and communicate these to others. So the reason I don't go to parties is because I am shy, or I am anxious, or I am socially awkward. So this becomes part of our account of ourselves. I am socially awkward. Other people are socially capable. So we create this account of ourselves, and this account of ourselves becomes part of the reason for our behaviors. So the behavior of not going to a party is because I am anxious, and this becomes part of our account. So these accounts of ourselves come together into something that might be called our identity or our own self story. From an ACT perspective, a healthy sense of self is one that's held lightly and allows for flexible responding. So, yes, we can have vague ideas of ourselves or light ideas of ourselves, but they shouldn't be solid. They shouldn't be strict rules that we apply to ourselves. I can't go to the party because I am shy. And this I am shy has become inherent and part of you and part of your account of yourself, and it's beginning to control your behaviors. So, from an ACT perspective, a healthy sense of self is one where we can say, yes, I have these lightly held notions about myself, but I can be flexible with them as well. So, for example, as I've said, someone might describe themselves as a shy person. But however, they should also be able to act in a confident and assertive manner when necessary. So they might have a story about themselves saying, oh, I'm a shy person, but perhaps they're a shy person in some situations. And then in other situations, in work situations or in a situation where they're very competent and able in an area, that they show themselves to be confident and assertive when needed. So this self as context and this self story becomes problematic when this shy self story becomes overly dominant, becomes overly strict, and it determines our behaviors across all life domains. Yes, okay, maybe you're shy in a few instances. Yes, perhaps you have a stronger tendency to be shy. But if this suddenly becomes wholly determining of your behaviors, this is when it begins to become a problem. So, for example, when I'm shy, precludes meeting new people or going for a new job or being vulnerable in a relationship. So if this profile, if this self view of I'm shy stops you from going out and meeting new people, stops you from applying for a job, etc., this is when it becomes problematic. These self stories or these identities can have positive or appetitive functions. So they give us a sense of comfort, they give us a sense of identity, they give us positive things. We're able to relate and identify ourselves as someone who's a shy person, or someone who's an outgoing person, or someone who's bad at maths, or someone who is, you identify as a student, you identify as a lawyer. You have this story about yourself and it becomes part of your identity, and there's positive things associated with that. However, there can also be aversive or negative functions to it. So, again, relating to this I'm shy story, the aversive or negative functions might be that it's restricting your life. So, because you're buying into this story that you're a shy person, and this is part of who you are, you're going to have a restricted life. So, ACT aims to create a relationship to the self as content so that it is not the defining feature. So the self as content means that yes, perhaps you have shy components to you. Yes, part of you is shy, but it doesn't mean that that is you completely. It's part of you, it's not the whole of you. So we often describe this as kind of thinking of it as a metaphor of a room. Within the room, there are multiple objects. One of those objects might be that you're shy. So if we conceptualize it in that way, the room is you, and in the room, there's objects. One of those objects is that you're shy. The whole room isn't you being shy. The whole room isn't that one object. There's lots of other objects in the room. So ACT aims to create this relationship to the self as content, so it's not the defining feature. So this one item in your room doesn't define your whole room. It's just one aspect of your room. So it's a lightly held part of who you are. It's not the whole part of who you are. The whole part of who you are is everything else that's in that room. And this aspect of shyness is just one component to you. So, as we've said, part of ACT is mindfulness and acceptance. And then part of ACT is getting you to behave in a way that's in line with your values. So, what are values? Values are qualities of purpose of action that can never be obtained as an object, but can be accessed moment by moment. So that effectively means that a value isn't a tangible physical object. It's not something that you feel that you can finally reach or attain, but it's a quality that you can access in moments and by doing certain things. So, ACT uses a variety of exercises to try to help clients choose what they value and identify what their life directions are and what is important to them in a variety of different domains in their family lives, their career lives, in their education, etc., etc. And this very much feeds into the self as context part as well. If people are holding on to one aspect or one domain of their lives too tightly, and if they're identifying with it too strongly, that piece of content becomes all of their story. So, for example, people who are very much viewing themselves as their job, some people almost live and breathe for their job. So they become fused with their self as content in terms of their job. So part of their room is their job. They're a lawyer, they're a bank manager, they're an accountant. And this part they hold really closely and they hold really tightly, and they focus so much attention on that one part themselves. But they need to be able to look at themselves in a broader context. They've got multiple things in that room, and they need to act in ways that are going to bring them in line with their values that aren't just based on their identity as their profession. So ACT uses a variety of exercises to help clients choose life directions in multiple domains, not just in one single domain. So the values part also tries to undermine verbal processes that might lead to choices based on avoidance, social compliance, or fusion. So effectively what this means is trying to step away from what values you think you should have, or what values you believe society thinks you should have, or what values are based on fusion. So, for example, I should value X. Why should you value this? Because your parents said so, because society said so, or a good person would value Y, or my mother wants me to value Z. These things are values that aren't inherently your own. Perhaps you're saying these things because you want to avoid talking about what you actually value. Perhaps it's because you want to be seen to be a good person, or perhaps it's because you're fusing with some thoughts. So we're trying to identify what are the individual's actual true values. So in ACT, acceptance, diffusion, being present, and so on are not the ends in themselves. They're a clear path for a more vital, values consistent life. So all these processes that we're engaging in are effectively trying to get us to act in a way that is in accordance with what we value, what we find important. Because only when we act and behave in a way that's going to bring us towards what we really value, what we really find important to ourselves, that's when we're going to be happiest. That's when we're going to feel fulfilled. So we engage in things like diffusion and being present and acceptance so that we can get to a place where we can act in a way that's most in line with our values. We can behave and carry out things that are going to help us reach our values. So, how do we identify our values then? Um, so, effectively, we have to ask, and through therapy, we'll identify deep down what's important to us. What do we want our life to be about? What sort of person do you want to be? What relationships do you want to have? They often say, if it comes to the end of your life, what do you want to be remembered for? What do you want people to say about you? So if you weren't spending so much time struggling with avoiding fears or struggling with your thoughts or trying to suppress emotions, etc., what would you spend your time doing? What would you channel your time and energy into doing? What do you really value? So, as I said, for example, imagine you're 80 years old and you're looking back on your life as it is today. Ask yourself, what did I spend too much time worrying about? I spent too little time doing things like, if I could go back in time, what would I do differently from today onwards? So these kind of things and these kind of questions are potentially going to help us access what do we value, what do we want, what's important to us. So once we've identified what our values are, what's important to us, then we need to commit to acting and behaving in a way that aligns with our values and aligns with things that are important to us. So, for example, if we have someone who is, they value friendship, they value social interaction, they value laughter, they value having good, positive social relationships with other people, are they going to be able to engage in behavior that's aligned with that? Perhaps they can't because they're having thoughts that people will laugh at them if they go to a party. So maybe they're fused with the thought that people will laugh at me if I go to this party. Perhaps part of their identity, perhaps part of their self as context is that they're an embarrassing person or they're not a good person. So acceptance, diffusion, all these components are trying to help us deal with those internal private events, experience them, accept them, say, yes, okay, they're there. Yes, okay, I'm having a thought. Part of you thinks that you are a bad person, a negative person, someone who's socially anxious, etc., but that isn't all of you. How do we then deal with these internal private events and then come out the other end and engage in behaviors which are aligned with your values? So finally, ACT encourages the development of larger and larger patterns of effective actions and behaviors linked with our chosen values. So in this component, ACT looks very much like traditional behavioral therapies, and almost any coherent behavioral change method can be fitted into an ACT protocol. So doing things like exposure, learning new skills, shaping, chaining, reinforcement, goal setting, etc., etc. So within this committed action part, we can engage in lots of different kinds of behavioral therapies. Perhaps it's really important to this socially anxious person to go out and to go to a party or to be able to go sit in a cafe. And perhaps they'll need to go through things like exposure therapy or skills therapy or reinforcement, etc., to try to get to that place. So concrete goals that are values consistent can be achieved. So it's always important to clearly outline and clearly identify what goals are we going to try to reach and how are these goals aligned with what our values are. So ACT protocols and ACT therapy almost always involves therapy work, but also homework and additional tasks that are linked to short-term goals, medium-term goals, and then ultimately long-term behavioral change goals. Behavior change efforts in turn lead to contact with psychological barriers that are addressed through other ACT processes, acceptance, diffusion, and so on and so on. So for example, if we're going through an exposure process, we're ultimately going to come up again against some of these thoughts that we're fused with, some of these emotions that we're trying to avoid, some of these self stories that we have about ourselves. So it's almost like a circle whereby we need to work with the acceptance, we need to work with the diffusion in order to engage in behaviors which are aligned with our values. But once we start engaging with these behaviors, we're then again probably going to come up against some more of those thoughts and some more of those feelings. And again, we need to engage in the acceptance, the diffusion, etc., etc. So just a reminder of Act 6 core processes: acceptance, allowing thoughts to come and go without struggling with them; cognitive diffusion, learning methods to reduce the tendency to fuse the self with our thoughts, images, emotions, and memories; coming in contact with the present moment, being aware of the here and now, trying to avoid future thinking and past thinking; having experienced openness, interest, and receptiveness to what's happening right here, right now, in this moment; considering the self as context; accessing a sense of self, and this continuity of consciousness which is unchanging. So things in the room might change, but the room itself stays the same. So this is the unchanging consciousness of ourselves. We are always ourselves, even though parts of us might change, things in the room might change, but the room will always be the same. Values, discovering what's most important to ourselves, and then engaging in committed action or committed behavior, setting goals, doing things that are in line with our values. So, to summarize, the core ACT processes are both overlapping and interrelated. So, although at times in interventions we may seem to just be targeting one of the components or one of the processes, and definitely they'll start out with one or two of the processes, there is natural overlap between them, and work done in one area can help in other areas as well. So, they are all interlinked with each other and they can all work together to help create psychological flexibility. Taken as a whole, each process supports the other and they all target psychological flexibility. Psychological flexibility can be defined as the process of contacting the present moment fully as a conscious human being and persisting or changing behavior in the service of our chosen values. So contacting the present moment fully, that means everything that we're feeling right here, right now, in this moment, in this time, and persisting or changing. So engaging with behaviors or changing with behaviors that are in service or that are in line with our chosen values that we have ourselves. So the 6 processes, as we've said, can be chunked into 2 groupings. So the mindfulness and acceptance processes. So these are the acceptance, diffusion, contact with the present moment, and self as context processes. And then the commitment and behavior change processes, identifying our values, engaging in committed action, and then contact with the present moment and self as context overlap between the two. So that brings us to the end of this portion of the lecture. There's obviously a lot more to ACT still. This has just been kind of surface level introduction to the main processes, to the main theory behind ACT. So there is a lot more to it for you to explore and discover. If there are parts that you think I haven't discussed in this lecture, but that you've found yourself through research for your assignment, absolutely do include them as long as they're relevant and they make sense and they're definitely part of ACT. I have a whole lot of resources up on the Moodle page. I have simple links to web pages that discuss things. I've got articles, I've got YouTube videos, podcasts. So there's a lot up there for you to have a look at. I haven't discussed in this lecture the techniques and tools and things they do within the therapy sessions. So, for example, they use a lot of metaphor within the therapy sessions because it's very language based. There's a lot of stuff out there on the different kind of things they do in the therapy sessions, the techniques and the metaphors that they use. And in some of the video links that I'll be giving you as well, there's examples of the kind of metaphors that they talk about. I wanted to finish up with this interesting quote. We've all, I'm sure, been binge watching during this social isolation time. And I watched Inside Out again the other day. And it's a great movie. If you haven't watched it, I recommend it. But it kind of struck home that part of it is very much about acceptance and acceptance of our emotions. And I went to look for a quote to put into this lecture from Inside Out. And one that I found was from Wikipedia. I don't usually condone or support the use of referencing Wikipedia, but I thought this was a valid point. If you don't know the story of Inside Out, this might not make sense to you. But if you do know the story of Inside Out, this might resonate with you in terms of what we're talking about in terms of accepting emotions. So by preventing Riley from feeling sad, Joy was also keeping her from feeling happiness. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. Within the story of Inside Out, Joy goes on this mission to try to stop Riley feeling sad, and then ultimately she realizes that sadness is important and has a really important role to play and is something that Riley needs to feel. And that without experiencing sadness, we don't fully experience happiness either. So as I said, don't usually support Wikipedia quotes, but I thought it was a good one for this lecture. Okay, so there are links here to a lot of YouTube videos. Some, as I said, on the kind of metaphors that they use in ACT therapy. Some are talks by Stephen Hayes. So have a look through them, watch them to gain more insight and gain more understanding. Or if you think you don't understand anything or haven't explained something well enough, perhaps you might get more of an insight and understanding from watching some of these YouTube links. The links will also be in the description box down below. And obviously you can get them from the slides on Moodle as well.